January 1943. Over the Arctic Circle. The sky was a swirling canvas of gray and white, pierced only by the shadowed silhouettes of heavy bombers fighting against an unrelenting blizzard. Frost crept along wings and fuselages, rivets groaning as metal contracted in the biting cold. Every breath rattled through oxygen masks, leaving faces stiff and raw. Above the frozen expanse, navigation was a gamble. Clouds erased landmarks, instruments froze, and the storm had a way of swallowing formations whole. Inside the cockpit of Silver Falcon, Lieutenant Daniel Dan Hayes clutched a small, battered device. A homemade compass, cobbled from salvaged parts and wire. Peers had mocked it during training, calling it superstition or childish tinkering. Yet today, as the formation faltered against the blinding storm, all conventional instruments had failed. The squadron was drifting, lost in the Arctic white, every second a step closer to disaster. Hayes traced the needle with frozen fingers, watching it resist the chaos around it. Other pilots shouted into radios, panic rising as visibility vanished. And then he gave a quiet command, a point of direction no one else could see. Slowly, the formation began to align, a fragile thread of hope through the storm. In that moment, ridicule became irrelevant. Survival depended on trust in one man's invention, and on the courage to follow it through the Arctic fury. Winter 1943 had transformed the Arctic skies into one of the most formidable battlefields of World War II. Allied squadrons, tasked with long-range bombing and reconnaissance missions, faced not only enemy fighters but the merciless Arctic environment. Freezing winds sliced across the open sky, temperatures plunged well below -40, and blinding snowstorms erased any trace of horizon. Pilots and crews, accustomed to European or North African theaters, quickly discovered that the Arctic demanded its own set of survival skills, technical adaptations, and navigational precision. Aircraft instrumentation, though advanced for its time, was severely tested by the extreme cold. Compasses, gyroscopic indicators, and radio navigation systems frequently malfunctioned in sub-zero conditions. Lubricants thickened, electrical components froze, and metal contracted unpredictably. Even small discrepancies in readings could send an entire formation miles off course, stranding bombers over inhospitable terrain or forcing emergency landings on frozen tundra. Losses in prior months had illustrated that environmental hazards were as lethal as any Luftwaffe interception. Against this backdrop, the squadron faced repeated failures in Arctic navigation. Historical records documented missions in which entire formations were delayed, scattered, or destroyed due to storms and instrument malfunction. In one instance, a bomber returning from a critical reconnaissance over Norway had nearly vanished into a whiteout for 12 hours before a fortunate break in visibility allowed landing. The mortality rate, both from exposure and navigational error, weighed heavily on commanders and crews alike. It was in this high-stakes context that Lieutenant Daniel Hayes' unconventional approach emerged. A mechanically curious airman, Hayes had spent months tinkering with salvaged compass components in the hangars. While other gunners and navigators relied exclusively on standard instruments, Hayes experimented with a small, homemade device designed to resist the fluctuations and failures of commercial compasses at extreme temperatures. His peers mocked the endeavor, joking that it was a toy or a superstition. Yet Hayes persisted, convinced that extreme conditions demanded extraordinary preparation. The squadron itself was composed of men drawn from diverse theaters of war. Pilots hardened in the deserts of North Africa, navigators experienced over the English Channel, and bombardiers trained in continental Europe. All were skilled, all disciplined, yet none were fully prepared for the Arctic's unique challenges. Every mission into the region required careful route planning, contingency preparation, and reliance on multiple overlapping navigation methods. Yet the whiteout storms, shifting wind patterns, and magnetic anomalies often rendered traditional methods unreliable. By January 17, 1943, the squadron was preparing for a critical resupply and reconnaissance mission over northern Norway. Intelligence reports emphasized the importance of the operation, tracking enemy convoys, verifying the presence of new radar installations, and disrupting German weather stations that guided U-boat operations. The stakes were high, and failure could result not only in loss of aircraft but in the compromise of Allied operations across the region. As the bombers lifted into the Arctic air, frost quickly formed on wings and fuselages. Ice accumulated on propellers, engines strained against turbulence, and the sky above transformed into a monochrome storm. Navigation instruments began to fail almost immediately. Compasses wavered, radio signals faded, and altitude readings fluctuated under the stress of the cold. Experienced pilots glanced nervously at their displays, calculating margin for error, aware that a single misstep could send them into a frozen wasteland. Amid this environment of mechanical failure and environmental hostility, Hayes' homemade compass became more than a curiosity. While others struggled to reconcile conflicting readings, he observed subtle variations in the needle, noted correlations with the position of the sun and cloud patterns, and began mapping a path through the storm. His knowledge of Arctic winds, magnetic anomalies, and aircraft drift allowed him to interpret his invention's readings in a way that conventional instruments could not. By the time the formation reached the heart of the storm, Hayes' presence and device represented their only reliable guidance. Mocked during training, overlooked by superiors and dismissed by colleagues, the homemade compass would now be tested in real conditions, the most unforgiving environment the squadron had yet encountered. The mission's success, and the lives of every crew member, depended on trust in one man's ingenuity and the courage to follow a path that defied conventional tools. As the bombers penetrated deeper into the Arctic storm, the challenges of navigation became relentless. Visibility dropped to near zero, with swirling snow erasing all sense of horizon. Standard gyroscopic compasses wavered unpredictably, affected by the cold and the Earth's magnetic anomalies near the pole. Radio navigation signals were intermittent, often distorted by atmospheric interference. Even the most experienced navigators faced a terrifying reality. Without reliable guidance, the formation could drift miles off course, plunging into icebound mountains or frozen seas. The squadron's leadership understood the stakes. Commander Major Edward Stokes had emphasized redundancy in navigational planning, pairing standard instruments with map readings, celestial calculations, and radio triangulation. Yet in this storm, every system faltered. Crew members murmured over intercoms, voices tight with anxiety, as they attempted to reconcile inconsistent readings. A single error could separate aircraft from formation, leaving them isolated in an environment where survival was uncertain. Lieutenant Hayes, seated at his station with his homemade compass, was quietly calculating a solution. The device was simple: a small magnetic needle, balanced on a precision pivot, encased to resist the Arctic cold and shielded from aircraft vibrations. It had been painstakingly calibrated over months, tested in hangar simulations and low-altitude flights. Hayes' peers had called it eccentric, even superstitious, yet its reliability in these extreme conditions would soon be proven. The squadron itself was tense. Gunners wiped frost from their sights, bombardiers double-checked instruments, and pilots fought the constant turbulence that pushed wings toward dangerous angles. Even minor course corrections became life-threatening maneuvers. Crew fatigue compounded stress, as long hours in freezing conditions numbed extremities and clouded judgment. Within this environment, Hayes' calm focus stood in stark contrast. He consulted the compass, traced the needle, and began mapping an emergent path, a lifeline for the entire formation. Earlier missions had demonstrated how quickly Arctic storms could overwhelm even seasoned airmen. Bombers had been lost in swirling whiteouts, radios failed, and pilots had resorted to emergency landings on frozen lakes or abandoned airfields. The survival rate, though respectable, was never guaranteed. Hayes had witnessed these failures firsthand and understood that, in such extremes, conventional training might offer little protection. Improvisation, careful observation, and trust in innovative solutions became not a choice, but a necessity. The squadron's skepticism of Hayes' compass persisted even in the storm. Peers glanced at the small device with doubt, questioning its accuracy in comparison to standardized instruments. Yet, the limitations of conventional tools were impossible to ignore. With gyroscopes drifting, radio beacons distorted, and cloud cover obscuring celestial navigation, the homemade compass emerged as the only device maintaining consistent readings. In this critical moment, mockery became irrelevant. Survival required trust in ingenuity over routine. As the formation fought through the tempest, subtle decisions mattered. A miscalculation in altitude could expose bombers to flak. A misjudged heading could lead them over mountainous terrain or open sea. Hayes cross-referenced his compass readings with wind drift and snow patterns, calculating corrections that instruments alone could not provide. Each adjustment subtly steered the formation, preventing dangerous divergence and keeping aircraft within visual range. By the time the storm's fury reached its peak, the squadron's cohesion depended entirely on this unconventional guidance. Other systems had faltered, morale wavered, and the possibility of disaster loomed. Yet Hayes' compass, once dismissed as a trivial invention, provided clarity amidst chaos. It was not only a tool but a symbol, a tangible embodiment of foresight, observation, and human ingenuity confronting extreme adversity. In the Arctic sky, where machines faltered and conventional wisdom failed, one airman's resourcefulness became the squadron's lifeline. The storm tested more than instruments. It tested trust, courage, and the willingness to embrace unconventional solutions. Hayes' homemade compass, small and unassuming, now held the responsibility of every life aboard the bombers. Its needle, steadfast against wind and cold, pointed the way, not only through the storm, but toward survival itself. Arctic missions demanded more than skill. They demanded endurance against conditions designed to break both body and mind. Crew members huddled in freezing cockpits, fingers stiff and numb, eyes constantly scanning instruments and skies. The blizzard was unrelenting, a constant reminder that survival was uncertain. Fatigue gnawed at judgment, and panic could spread like wildfire in a formation struggling against the storm. In this environment, trust was the ultimate currency. Hayes' peers had mocked his homemade compass during training, yet when conventional instruments failed, they had no choice but to rely on him. Confidence in a single man, in a small, fragile device, transformed anxiety into coordinated action. Every adjustment he made to course or heading carried life or death weight. Crew members who had doubted now watched him closely, their morale and focus anchored by his calm, deliberate movements. Navigation over the Arctic was a technological nightmare. Standard compasses suffered magnetic interference at high latitudes. Gyroscopes drifted unpredictably under sub-zero temperatures. Radios, critical for positional triangulation, were subject to atmospheric distortions and intermittent failures. Hayes' homemade compass, in contrast, was specifically adapted for these extremes. Its magnetic needle, balanced on a resilient pivot and insulated from vibration and frost, remained consistent where manufactured devices faltered. The innovation lay not in complexity but in precision. By isolating the needle from aircraft vibrations and shielding it from temperature fluctuations, Hayes created a miniature system capable of reliable readings when others failed. In effect, he had engineered a redundancy that addressed the specific challenges of Arctic navigation, a solution that blended practicality with ingenuity. Squadron survival depended on maintaining formation and avoiding disorientation. In a whiteout, one lost bomber could jeopardize the entire mission. Enemy aircraft and ground defenses exploited these vulnerabilities. Hayes' compass ensured that the formation remained on a steady, verifiable heading, minimizing the risk of separation or miscalculations that could expose the squadron to attack. From a tactical perspective, the reliability of one instrument became a force multiplier. It allowed pilots to maintain cohesion, execute evasive maneuvers, and navigate around hazards that might otherwise scatter them. In this context, A simple homemade device dictated the operational effectiveness of an entire mission. Hayes exemplified leadership through action. Rather than adhering strictly to standard procedures, he recognized the limitations of instruments and devised a solution. By trusting his innovation, he implicitly commanded confidence from the squadron. Leadership in this context was less about issuing orders and more about demonstrating competence under extreme conditions. His decision to rely on a non-standard tool challenged conventional military thinking. Yet in practice, it validated the principle that innovation in the field, grounded in observation and experience, could surpass rigid protocol. Hayes' initiative bridged the gap between risk and survival, influencing not only the squadron's immediate fate but the broader perception of adaptive problem-solving in Arctic operations. Fear is magnified in environments where death can arrive silently, without warning. Crew members were acutely aware of the stakes. Every misreading, every miscalculation could result in aircraft lost over frozen seas or mountainous terrain. Hayes' compass provided more than directional accuracy. It provided assurance. The psychological impact was profound. Confidence in the instrument bolstered crew morale, reinforcing focus and precision under pressure. Conversely, the enemy or environmental threats became less intimidating because the squadron maintained cohesion and direction. In high-stakes scenarios, trust in ingenuity proved as critical as the tools themselves. Across these angles, one truth emerges. War is shaped not only by machines, strategy, and firepower, but by human insight, ingenuity, and trust. Hayes' homemade compass transformed what might have been disaster into coordinated survival. It illustrates that even small acts of foresight and preparation can exert outsized influence in extreme conditions, ensuring that ingenuity, courage, and adaptability prevail where conventional tools falter. The storm raged on, and every needle adjustment carried consequences beyond the immediately visible. Above the Arctic expanse, one airman's quiet innovation had become the invisible backbone of the mission, guiding men and machines through chaos with unwavering precision. From the Luftwaffe's perspective, the Arctic mission presented an opportunity for opportunistic strikes. Reports from German reconnaissance aircraft often noted that Allied formations in this region were vulnerable to misnavigation. Pilots expected bombers to scatter under Arctic storms, creating isolated targets easy to engage. Yet, during this particular sortie, the predictable chaos never occurred. Formation integrity was maintained, movements precise, and evasive maneuvers executed with uncanny coordination. Enemy pilots described the baffling phenomenon of bombers holding straight courses despite whiteout conditions. Standard assumptions about human error and mechanical failure were overturned. The homemade compass, though invisible to them, had effectively eliminated the vulnerabilities the Luftwaffe relied upon. Attacks were less effective, pilots hesitated, and coordination broke down. The impact was both tactical and psychological. Where confusion was expected, clarity prevailed. The Arctic demanded technological adaptation. Conventional magnetic compasses drifted near the pole, radios were distorted, and gyroscopic instruments were prone to mechanical failure in sub-zero conditions. Hayes' homemade compass was deceptively simple, yet it addressed each of these limitations. Its insulated casing protected the needle from frost, its balanced pivot resisted aircraft vibrations, and its calibration allowed readings unaffected by the magnetic anomalies prevalent in polar regions. The innovation demonstrated that sometimes low-tech solutions can outperform standard technology in extreme conditions. While engineers debated large-scale solutions, Hayes' device provided immediate reliability, bridging a critical gap between design limitations and operational necessity. In the Arctic, precision and adaptability proved more valuable than complexity or scale. Leadership in wartime extends beyond issuing orders. It encompasses decision-making under uncertainty and inspiring trust. Hayes, though not a commanding officer, exemplified this principle. By relying on his homemade compass and calmly guiding the squadron, he demonstrated competence and instilled confidence. The squadron followed his directions without hesitation, recognizing that survival depended on his insight. This form of field leadership highlights a critical lesson. Authority is reinforced through demonstrated reliability. Hayes' innovation elevated him to a central role, not by rank, but by the trust he earned through action. His leadership bridged gaps between skepticism and necessity, proving that ingenuity can command respect even in hierarchical structures. The story also carries a moral dimension. War is unforgiving, and in extreme conditions, rigid adherence to protocol can be deadly. Hayes' homemade compass was born from a recognition of these risks and a commitment to the crew's survival. Courage is not always dramatic. It is often quiet, deliberate, and meticulous. By acting on his insight, Hayes saved lives and validated the principle that personal initiative, when grounded in skill and observation, is both ethical and practical. His innovation reminds us that moral responsibility in extreme environments is inseparable from ingenuity, foresight, and a willingness to defy convention for the sake of others. Beyond immediate survival, the compass represents the interface between human intelligence and environmental adversity. In a theater dominated by technology and doctrine, a small, handmade instrument became the decisive factor in life-or-death outcomes. It symbolizes how creativity and observation can transcend limitations imposed by equipment, weather, and expectation. The device also embodies the broader truth that human ingenuity is a force multiplier. While large-scale systems provide capability, survival in extreme conditions often depends on the subtle, personalized interventions of individuals who understand context, anticipate failure, and innovate. Hayes' compass became both a literal and metaphorical guide through chaos. Finally, the psychological impact of the compass was profound. Trust in instruments, in leadership, and in human ingenuity directly affected morale. Crew members relied on Hayes' readings to maintain formation, coordinate maneuvers, and make decisions under pressure. Confidence in the device reduced panic, allowed focus, and mitigated fatigue. Conversely, the enemy faced the opposite effect: hesitation and uncertainty. They anticipated errors, miscalculations, and disarray, yet encountered steady navigation and coordinated formation defense. Psychological advantage, born from trust in one man's innovation, amplified the tactical effect of the compass far beyond its size or complexity. Across all angles, human, technical, tactical, leadership, moral, symbolic, and psychological, Hayes' homemade compass emerges as more than a tool. It becomes a nexus of survival, innovation, and courage. In the Arctic storm, it transformed what could have been disaster into a testament of human ingenuity, proving that preparation, observation, and adaptability can decisively alter outcomes even in the most extreme conditions. Above the frozen expanse, amidst blizzard and ice, a single needle guided not only machines but the lives, trust, and hopes of an entire squadron. The Arctic storm intensified as the squadron pressed forward, each bomber struggling against turbulence that tossed wings and rattled fuselages. Visibility was reduced to mere feet, a solid wall of white stretching endlessly. Instruments were failing in unison. Gyroscopes spun erratically, compasses wavered, and radio signals vanished intermittently. Panic simmered in the cockpits as crew members adjusted throttles and rudders, searching desperately for bearings that did not exist. In the cockpit of Silver Falcon, Lieutenant Daniel Hayes held the homemade compass steady, fingers numbed but precise. The needle, isolated from vibration and insulated against frost, pointed unerringly. Sweat froze along his brow beneath the oxygen mask, yet his focus never faltered. Around him, peers shouted over intercoms, warnings of deviations and concern for separation, but Hayes' voice remained calm, a fixed point of certainty in a sky consumed by chaos. The squadron had begun to scatter. Aircraft drifted unpredictably, some banking into sudden gusts that threatened structural integrity. Without reliable navigation, formation cohesion was at risk. Enemy reconnaissance, although largely absent in this storm, could have exploited such disarray. Each pilot's survival hinged on accurate heading, precise altitude corrections, and the ability to maintain formation despite the storm's fury. Hayes cross-referenced the compass needle with subtle cues from snow patterns and cloud movement. Calculations were mental, performed rapidly under extreme duress. He relayed adjustments to nearby aircraft, directing minor heading corrections to keep the formation aligned. Each command was measured, a combination of instinct, experience, and trust in his device. Other gunners and navigators struggled with frozen instruments. One navigator cursed as his gyro spun without stabilizing, while a bombardier shook frost from his charts, eyes wide with exhaustion. Crew fatigue compounded every error, and yet Hayes' calm precision provided an anchor. Even skeptical pilots began to adjust their heading according to his instructions, relying on a small compass that had been dismissed as trivial months earlier. The storm's fury peaked over a ridge of jagged ice. Visibility dropped to near zero, snow scouring the windscreen, engines straining against turbulence. Every adjustment carried life or death weight. A single miscalculation could drive a bomber into the ice fields below, and the distance between safety and disaster was measured in mere hundreds of feet. Hayes' guidance held the formation steady, threading them through narrow windows of opportunity that would otherwise have been invisible. For hours, the squadron relied entirely on his readings. The psychological toll was immense. Tension gripped every member of the crew. Muscles stiffened from constant adjustment, and fear lingered just beneath the surface. Yet cohesion persisted. The homemade compass was more than a tool. It had become a lifeline, converting panic into coordinated action. Above, the storm seemed to mock them with relentless force, winds buffeting wings, ice forming rapidly along fuselage edges, and snowflakes whipping like shrapnel. Hayes remained focused, interpreting the needle's movement, adjusting for drift, and communicating corrections. One by one, aircraft stabilized their heading, maintaining formation under conditions that should have forced dispersion. The effectiveness of the device was undeniable. Where conventional instruments failed, this handmade compass provided continuous, accurate readings. The formation avoided dangerous deviations, navigated around treacherous ice ridges, and maintained altitude despite turbulent updrafts. Hayes' foresight and preparation had transformed uncertainty into controlled survival. The squadron pressed on, guided by a small needle and a single man's ingenuity. Each adjustment, each minor course correction, allowed the bombers to maintain cohesion and avoid catastrophic miscalculations. In the heart of the Arctic storm, ridicule and doubt had no place. Only precision, trust, and relentless focus mattered. By the end of the first critical stage, the squadron had passed the most perilous stretch of the storm. Aircraft remained intact, formation unbroken, and crew morale, though strained, had stabilized. Hayes' homemade compass had proven its worth beyond any debate. What was once mocked now dictated the survival of the entire mission, transforming a potential disaster into a controlled, albeit tense, passage through one of the harshest environments imaginable. The storm had not relented. The squadron, though still intact, faced the second and most dangerous leg of their journey, crossing a vast stretch of frozen sea where one miscalculation could mean catastrophe. Icebergs jutted unpredictably, and the wind shifted in sudden gusts that could flip an aircraft or stall a wing. Instruments had completely failed in many bombers. Gyroscopes spun wildly, compasses oscillated, and radio signals vanished. Panic simmered quietly beneath the thin veneer of protocol. Hayes' homemade compass, however, remained steadfast. Its needle, perfectly balanced and insulated, cut through the Arctic chaos. He consulted it continuously, calculating subtle heading adjustments, accounting for wind drift, and relaying directions to pilots in real time. His calm, deliberate commands became a tether for the scattered formation. Without him, disorientation would have fractured the squadron, exposing aircraft to environmental hazards and enemy interception. The pilots trusted him implicitly. Even those who had once mocked the device followed his guidance without hesitation, adjusting headings, maintaining altitude, and synchronizing maneuvers. Crew members repeated corrections, checking positions against frozen instruments that could no longer be trusted. Hayes' compass, small and unassuming, had become the linchpin of survival. The Arctic storm tested every skill the airmen possessed. Engines labored against turbulence, propellers accumulated ice, and winds threatened to drive aircraft off course. Hayes monitored subtle shifts in the needle, cross-referencing them with snow patterns and cloud formations. Every slight deviation was corrected immediately, preventing even minor errors from accumulating into life-threatening drift. Meanwhile, visibility dropped further. The horizon disappeared entirely, replaced by a wall of white. Formation integrity became nearly impossible to maintain without continuous guidance. The squadron's cohesion, normally maintained by instruments and radio coordination, depended entirely on Hayes' innovation. He adjusted headings incrementally, avoiding hidden ice ridges and low-lying snowdrifts that could have destroyed aircraft in moments. The storm was relentless, but human ingenuity prevailed. Hayes' calculations, informed by intuition, observation, and his homemade compass, provided a reliable path through chaos. Aircraft responded precisely to his guidance. Where mechanical instruments had failed, a single man's preparation and ingenuity ensured continuous navigation, turning a near-impossible journey into a controlled operation. Above the frozen sea, enemy reconnaissance became irrelevant. The Luftwaffe could not exploit the squadron's position because the bombers maintained an accurate, steady course despite total instrument failure. The psychological effect was equally profound. Crew confidence, initially eroded by fear and uncertainty, strengthened with each successful correction. Trust in Hayes' guidance allowed focus, precision, and coordination to persist under the most extreme conditions. Hours passed like minutes. Every decision carried immense consequences. Hayes' focus never wavered. His finger traced the needle, his eyes scanned for environmental cues, and his voice remained calm over the intercom, issuing instructions that bridged the gap between chaos and order. The squadron followed with near-perfect cohesion, avoiding hazards, maintaining altitude, and staying on course toward relative safety. Eventually, the edge of the Arctic storm came into sight. The wind lessened, visibility improved, and the frozen expanse stretched into recognizable landmarks. The squadron had survived a passage that might have seemed impossible just hours before. Hayes' homemade compass, once dismissed as a trivial invention, had dictated the survival of every aircraft, every crew member. Landing preparations began, but the weight of what had been accomplished remained. The storm had tested not only machines and instruments but human ingenuity, resolve, and courage. Hayes' quiet innovation had turned doubt into survival, skepticism into trust. The squadron, intact and guided by one man's foresight, had returned from the Arctic chaos. In the aftermath of the storm, the true value of the compass became clear. It was more than a navigational tool. It was proof that small, deliberate acts of preparation could decisively alter outcomes in extreme conditions. Where conventional wisdom and standard instruments failed, human ingenuity, focused, precise, and courageous, prevailed. The squadron owed its survival not to chance, but to the needle of a homemade compass and the mind that guided it. When the last bomber touched down on the frost-lined airstrip, the tension that had gripped the squadron for hours finally released in collective exhalation. Engines idled, wings shuddered in residual turbulence, and frost clung stubbornly to fuselages. The Arctic storm, which had threatened to scatter or destroy the formation, was behind them, but the memory of its fury lingered in every shivering hand and numbed face. The success of the mission, though statistically unremarkable on paper, carried profound implications. All aircraft had returned intact. Crew members were alive. Supplies and reconnaissance information had been delivered. Yet beyond these outcomes, the survival of the squadron owed itself to one factor that no report could fully quantify: the homemade compass that had guided them through chaos. Hayes' invention, once mocked, now commanded silent respect throughout the unit. Within hours, conversations among the crew revolved around the device and its creator. Pilots who had laughed at Hayes' tinkering months earlier now described the compass in terms of life-or-death importance. Gunners recounted moments when visibility had vanished completely, and only Hayes' steady guidance had kept aircraft aligned. Navigators compared notes, realizing that readings from their instruments had been erratic, while the compass had consistently pointed the way. The shift from skepticism to admiration was unanimous. Commanders began to recognize the operational value of Hayes' approach. Though formal documentation often downplayed individual improvisation, internal memos highlighted that missions in extreme Arctic conditions could no longer rely solely on standard instruments. Hayes' device demonstrated the necessity of adaptive solutions, and even traditional engineers and strategists took notice of its reliability. It became a subtle catalyst for rethinking how crews approached navigation in severe environments. The psychological impact extended beyond individual recognition. Trust in ingenuity, once abstract, became tangible. Crew members gained confidence not only in the compass but in their own ability to survive the Arctic's hostility. Fear, which had been pervasive during the storm, now gave way to a measured understanding. Preparation, observation, and innovation could bridge the gap between life and death. Morale, a fragile commodity in extreme conditions, experienced a quiet but meaningful boost. Outside the squadron, intelligence and reconnaissance officers noted an unusual pattern. Allied Arctic missions had begun showing greater consistency in navigation and formation cohesion. While Hayes' compass was not publicly credited, its underlying principles, careful observation, adaptability, and redundancy, were slowly influencing Arctic operations. Commanders began to incorporate similar techniques in other units, validating the idea that one individual's innovation could ripple across an entire theater of operations. On a human level, Hayes' reputation evolved. No medals were immediately awarded, and the press remained unaware of his contribution, but within the squadron, his status was elevated. He was no longer the eccentric tinkerer. He was the man whose preparation and foresight had preserved lives. The respect of peers, reinforced by the undeniable proof of survival, carried more weight than formal accolades. The storm itself, while now a memory, left a lasting imprint. Crews recounted the terrifying wind gusts, near-zero visibility, and the sensation of being suspended over an endless frozen expanse. Yet intertwined with these recollections was the guiding needle of the homemade compass, an anchor amidst chaos, a thread of certainty in a sky defined by uncertainty. The narrative of survival became inseparable from Hayes' quiet ingenuity, illustrating that in extreme conditions, small innovations can produce outsized consequences. By the end of the day, the squadron had not only survived but had set a precedent. The mission demonstrated that trust in human ingenuity could outperform technology when instruments failed. It was a reminder that leadership, preparation, and courage could transform even a modest device into a decisive tool of survival. Hayes' homemade compass had turned ridicule into respect, skepticism into reliance, and an Arctic storm into a testament of human resourcefulness. In the days following the Arctic mission, the impact of Hayes' homemade compass extended beyond immediate survival. Internal debriefs highlighted not only the squadron's successful return, but also the reliability of adaptive techniques under extreme conditions. Officers and navigators recognized that traditional instruments alone were insufficient in high-latitude operations. Hayes' innovation, while simple, provided a reproducible method that could inform future Arctic sorties. Crew discussions became more than recounting the storm. They analyzed the factors that had prevented disaster. Gunners described moments when visibility vanished entirely, yet they maintained formation because of the subtle heading adjustments relayed by Hayes. Pilots reflected on how minor corrections had prevented deviations that could have led to fatal collisions or forced landings on treacherous ice. The homemade compass had become a benchmark for operational success in conditions previously considered uncontrollable. The psychological effect persisted as well. Trust, once fragile and easily shaken by extreme conditions, became a central theme in squadron cohesion. Crew members understood that their survival depended not solely on equipment, rank, or protocol, but on the initiative and foresight of individuals willing to innovate under pressure. Hayes' calm authority and the compass he engineered inspired confidence, allowing airmen to act decisively rather than react in panic. Technical officers began evaluating the broader applications of Hayes' approach. The compass demonstrated the importance of insulation, vibration isolation, and careful calibration, principles that could be integrated into future Arctic navigation tools. While mass production of identical devices was never pursued immediately, Hayes' work influenced design considerations, pilot training, and pre-flight preparation in ways that subtly improved overall mission reliability. Even the squadron's leadership acknowledged the broader implications. Survival rates for Arctic missions, historically inconsistent due to environmental hazards, could be improved through targeted adaptation. Hayes' compass provided a living proof of concept that minor innovations, grounded in observation and experimentation, could yield disproportionately large results. Commanders quietly encouraged other airmen to seek similar solutions, fostering a culture of ingenuity alongside strict adherence to protocol. Morale across the unit shifted in subtle but measurable ways. Crew members, having witnessed firsthand the value of careful preparation and creativity, approached subsequent missions with renewed confidence. The fear of disorientation, which had previously dominated Arctic sorties, was mitigated by an understanding that human initiative could overcome limitations imposed by both environment and equipment. Hayes' success became a psychological anchor for future operations, instilling a sense of agency and resilience. Beyond the immediate squadron, Hayes' story traveled informally among other Arctic units. Pilots and navigators shared the account of the homemade compass, emphasizing its role in preserving formation and lives. While official records remained largely silent, word-of-mouth accounts influenced thinking across the theater. Airmen began to appreciate that survival often relied as much on observation, adaptation, and ingenuity as on standardized equipment or rank. In retrospect, the Arctic Storm mission highlighted several enduring truths. Extreme environments amplify both the limitations of machines and the value of human ingenuity. Conventional tools, while important, can fail under conditions beyond their design parameters. In these circumstances, individual initiative, creativity, and precise execution can transform potential catastrophe into coordinated survival. Hayes' compass was the embodiment of this principle: small, adaptive, and decisively effective. Ultimately, the squadron's safe return reinforced a lesson often overlooked in wartime planning. Innovation, courage, and trust in one another can bridge the gap between life and death. Hayes' quiet invention, once dismissed as trivial or eccentric, had proven its worth under the harshest conditions imaginable. The Arctic storm, which might have ended in disaster, became instead a testament to foresight, preparation, and the subtle but transformative power of human ingenuity. The squadron had survived not because of standard procedures alone, nor because of superior technology, but because one man's insight, focus, and courage had provided a reliable path through chaos. In doing so, Hayes had left an enduring imprint, a reminder that in the extremities of war, the most profound tools are often those crafted by human mind and hand. History often celebrates grand strategies, decisive battles, and technological breakthroughs, but the quiet acts of ingenuity that shape outcomes are frequently overlooked. Lieutenant Daniel Hayes' homemade compass embodies this truth. A simple device, crafted from salvaged parts and human foresight, became the difference between survival and disaster for an entire Arctic squadron. It was not doctrine, rank, or weaponry that saved them. It was observation, preparation, and the courage to act on unconventional solutions. The Arctic storm exemplified an environment where conventional tools faltered. Standard compasses drifted near the pole, gyroscopes became unreliable, and radio signals were distorted or lost entirely. Yet, in these conditions, Hayes' ingenuity prevailed. His compass, calibrated, insulated, and balanced against vibration, provided reliable guidance where machines failed. More than a tool, it was a manifestation of human adaptability, the capacity to confront uncertainty with insight and precision. The psychological dimension of the story is equally significant. Fear and fatigue, omnipresent in extreme environments, were mitigated by trust in a fellow airman and his invention. Crew members followed Hayes' guidance with confidence, transforming panic into coordinated action. The enemy, whose strategy relied on disorientation and mechanical failure, was rendered irrelevant. In high-stakes scenarios, human trust and ingenuity proved as decisive as tactics or technology. Beyond survival, Hayes' compass serves as a symbol. It reminds us that leadership is not defined solely by rank, and heroism is not always visible. Innovation, diligence, and courage, applied quietly and deliberately, can reshape outcomes on a scale far larger than the individual. Hayes' needle, steady against Arctic chaos, guided more than machines. It guided human determination, resilience, and trust. In the end, the mission's success was more than a triumph over nature. It was a testament to the enduring power of human creativity under extreme conditions. The Arctic storm could have claimed lives, scattered aircraft, and frustrated strategic objectives. Instead, it became a story of survival, precision, and the extraordinary impact of a single, carefully crafted invention. Hayes' compass transformed skepticism into confidence, danger into order, and uncertainty into survival, leaving an indelible mark on both history and the human spirit. It is a reminder that in the extremities of war and life, ingenuity, courage, and foresight can transform the seemingly ordinary into the extraordinary, shaping outcomes, inspiring trust, and proving that the most profound tools are often those born from human insight and determination.